Good morning. Good morning. Welcome. Welcome to the 13th Tech at State on Mobile Diplomacy. My name is Niru Lal. I'm here from the Bureau of Information Resource Management at the Department of State. Tech at State is brought to you by the innovative staff of eDiplomacy. Today at GW's Jack Morton Auditorium, we have an impressive range of experts from government agencies, the private sector, as well as academia to discuss the future of mobile technology and how we can harness the power of mobile both in Washington and abroad to empower U.S. diplomacy and now and in the future. So before we get started, I just wanted to remind you about the Wi-Fi password in the back of your card. I know we're no longer in the year 2013, so the password is guest14. So it's incorrect in the back of your card. The user ID is correct, but the password is guest14. So I would like to know if anyone's here has a mobile phone. Just making sure. All right. You're in the right place. All right. So speaking of phones, this event is mobile diplomacy. So please keep your phones on. Go ahead and text and tweet and post, and like my kids do, Snapchat, Instagram, whatever you want. Nobody's going to judge. No one's going to think it's rude unless you leave your ringtone on and it's a serenade for your neighbor. They may not like that, but suggest you lower your ringtones and go ahead and text and tweet. First of all, I'd like to thank our wonderful speakers and presenters and panelists who have all donated their time and energy preparing presentations and for joining us at Tech at State. Please note, if you see someone with a red ribbon on their ID card, that denotes a speaker. Please reach out and thank them for the time they took to be here today and for the great job they did. A big thank you to the staff of IRM's eDiplomacy for bringing you this and all of the other 12 Tech at States. I'd also like to recognize the support of senior leadership. Here with us today, we have Deputy Chief Information Officer from the Department of State, Minister Counselor Patricia Lucina, my former boss who's right in front here today. Nice to have you here. I'd also like to give a shout out to the embassies who are watching from all over the world. So far, we know we have London, Libreville, Bogota, Yerevan, and Mexico City, to name a few. We'll be looking out for comments and questions on Twitter from all those who are watching from home. Speaking of which, if you know folks that are chained to their desks, they couldn't make it here today, they can watch it on the internet. Please send them a text, a tweet, or whatever you want. Tell them to go to tech.state.gov/live. That's tech.state.gov/live, and they can watch us right now. Watch me make that mistake I just did. So. All right, so we are, speaking of Twitter, if you will follow us at Tech at State and use hashtag Tech at State, we always manage to get hashtag Tech at State trending. So let's not make this an exception. Let's see how quickly we can do it today. So for the Twitterati, we have our first Twitter poll. It should be on the screen now. Go ahead and tell us who you are. Introduce yourself. We want to know who's here. We have an impressive crowd. I'm sure it'll continue to get better throughout the day. And let us know, are you from, use one of the hashtags. Are you from academia, civil society, government, or industry? In addition to mentioning at Tech at State. So we'll let you know the results of that shortly. So without further ado, I would like to present our first speaker moderator who will be sharing perspectives on mobile diplomacy. Tom Shoop is the Executive Vice President and Editor-in-Chief in Government Executive Media Group. Tom oversees editorial operations for Government Executive, govexec.com, NextGov, and Defense One. Tom joined Government Executive magazine in 1989 and has interviewed the Vice President, the White House Chief of Staff, and various cabinet secretaries. I think if you give him a warm welcome, he might tell us which vice president. Couldn't figure that one out. So please join me in welcoming Tom Shoop.
Thank you, Neeru. And it was Vice President Gore. I'm dating myself. Thank you for that introduction. I'm not at all the main event today, so I'd like to introduce you to the people who are on the stage this morning. First, to my right is Catherine A. Novelli, who was sworn in as Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment on February 18th of this year. In this capacity, she leads efforts to develop and implement economic growth, energy, agricultural, oceans, environmental, and science and technology policies. Before assuming her current position, she was Vice President for Worldwide Government Affairs at Apple, Inc. There she was responsible for Apple's federal, international, and state and local government relations. So my first question to you is going to be, can you hook me up with an iPhone 6? Undersecretary Novelli also has extensive previous experience in government, serving as Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Europe and the Mediterranean, Deputy Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Central and Eastern Europe and Eurasia, and in the Office of the General Counsel at the Commerce Department. So thank you, Undersecretary, for being with us. And to my far, far right, that's not a political statement, but coming to us live from London is Ambassador Matthew W. Barzun, who is Ambassador to the United States to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. He previously served as Ambassador to Sweden from 2009 to 2011. Ambassador Barzun is an internet pioneer who was the fourth employee at CNET Networks, where he worked from 1993 to 2004. He served in a number of roles at CNET, including Executive Vice President, Chief Strategy Officer, and a member of the Executive Committee. During his time there, he launched Download.com, which grew to become CNET's biggest site, and went on to co-lead all of CNET's online properties, including CNET.com and News.com. Thank you, Ambassador Barzun, for being with us today, virtually.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'd like to get right to it. Both of you, as your bios indicated, come from a significant private sector experience in the technology sector. How have you brought that into your work at the State Department?
Take it away, Kathy.
Okay. Well, one of the ways that I brought it is that the first thing I did when I walked in the door at the State Department, frankly, I was very surprised by how far behind in technology state was. So I pushed very hard for the ability to use better mobile technology. And so I was one of the very first people at the State Department to be allowed to use a fully functional iPad for all of my briefing materials, for everything, my email, everything. And it's just been fantastic because it's allowed me to be connected, truly connected, while being mobile. And that's now being rolled out to the entire department. And I think it's a great thing, as are iPhones being rolled out to the entire department. And that's not a commercial for my former employer. It's about having high quality, smart technology that allows you to be doing your job where you are and to be connected at all times. And I think that's what this is all about.
Great. Ambassador, how did you bring your tech sector experience to bear?
Well, clearly I was less effective than my co-panelist because I am proud of this Canadian smartphone. But what I chose to focus on, I guess, was less the actual technology and more the state of mind and the kind of questions we were asking each other. Having worked, as you mentioned, in the internet sector and then worked on campaigns, I had witnessed firsthand the power of asking other people for help. Technology is a huge help in terms of asking people for help. And so, as we all know, those of us in this group that work in the State Department, and there are good reasons for this, but it's often a culture of tasking and not asking. So I really focus not so much on what device we have and what it can do, but what we do in the offline world. Are we developing the habits around asking other people for help who don't work in our buildings. And then once you get that going right, you can use technology to amplify that.
What are the biggest differences between the government and the private sector in your experience?
I think one of the biggest differences is that there is, I think, much less aversion to taking on risk in the government. And I understand that because you're representing the United States and you don't want to inadvertently do something that's going to, blow up the world. But I think in the private sector, especially in the technology sector, you innovate or you don't exist anymore. And as Matthew was saying, I think that attitude of being willing to take risks and calculated risks is an important thing, and being extremely accountable for results, and so always driving to concrete results. And I think that's the other piece that I think it's more difficult to measure results in diplomacy. And things take a lot longer time. So I think sometimes you can be lulled into, well, we'll just meet and we'll meet and we'll meet. And I think there is a mindset of, okay, to what end are we doing this? And if it's not working, we need to do something else.
Ambassador, what's your experience been?
Well, I would just echo what Kathy said exactly, and this was brought home to this issue of risk-taking, and it was brought home to me. A senior Foreign Service officer, a great friend, he just retired, one of the smartest people I've ever worked with, public sector, private sector, campaign, you name it. And I was talking basically what Kathy said and asking him for his guidance on how I could be more effective. And he said, well, look, you folks from the private sector come in, you talk about wins all the time. He said, we have wins, you know what? And they're worth about 10 points. And when we screw up, have failure, whatever name you want to give it, which we all inevitably do, it's worth minus 1,000. You do the math.
Is this?
I have no great answers, but that was his, I think, compelling point about, and it led to an interesting discussion among our country team about, well, okay, should we try to make wins worth more, or should we try to make setbacks, failures, cost less? We're grappling with this right now. I don't have any great answers.
Is this a particularly difficult issue at the State Department where you're dealing with highly sensitive information all the time?
I'm sure, yeah.
Yeah, I think so. And like the ambassador, I had a conversation with somebody I deeply respect who has retired from the Foreign Service now and is at RAND. And what he was saying is, well, the conservatism with a small c, the kind of not wanting to take risks, stems from the fact that if you make a mistake, just like was said, that's a huge, huge problem. And so people want to check and double check and double check. I think that, though, that it's very important to, in your mind, be trying to think about if you don't like something that's suggested, the answer isn't just how do I cut this down, but what do I have to replace it with that is going to work. And I think that's the piece that is important to be brought to bear as we go forward.
So in this set of circumstances where risk aversion is an issue, how do you, on a day-to-day basis, address that? And can an organization as vast and whose work is as critical as the State Department, can they afford to fail fast in the way things are commonly done in the tech sector? Ambassador, do you have thoughts on that?
Oh, I'm reminded of this great story that, you know how every year they put out these rankings of how well each country does on educational attainment? And certainly those Americans here in the group always wish we scored a bit higher, and we don't. And the Brits, by the way, we have a bunch of Brits and Australians here in the room with me in London. We don't score as well as we think we ought to. And you know the one country that sort of always wins, and when they don't win, they come in second? Finland, speaking of good mobile telephony. And so this guy who used to run the state schools in Finland is always yanked over to America to present to curious Americans on how we can do better on the list. And of course, like all Finns, he speaks great English, but he said he always gets the one question from every American, which is about teacher accountability. And he tells the story, he says, we don't have a word for accountability in Finnish. But he talks to his other Finnish American friend who explains what it is. And he goes, oh, I understand. Accountability is that thing you have left after you've removed responsibility. I think that's a pretty powerful point. And we use the word accountability, which is sometimes sort of code for how can I fire you? You know what I mean? And if we use the word accountability in that sort of narrow sense, responsibility is a full concept which encapsulates accountability. But that's a small part, like sort of lust is a small part of love. And how did I get onto that? That was very undiplomatic. But I think we've got these men and women all around the world on the U.S. diplomat side who are incredibly smart, bring a wealth of knowledge, deeply responsible, and they're very good at the full concept of responsibility and knowing what trade-offs to make. So further empowering the full concept of responsibility is something I try to do in my corner of the world here.
Is that issue of empowerment something you focus on too?
I think it's critical. I think you want to unleash creativity, and if some of that creativity means something isn't perfect, but people go for it, that should be rewarded.
So along those lines, there's been an increasing trend in government to engage in public-private partnerships and a spirit of innovation from the tech industry coming into government. You see that in President Obama naming Megan Smith, a former Google executive, to be the next chief technology officer, and he's sent Todd Park out to Silicon Valley to essentially be an ambassador there and get people to work on government projects. What do you think are some specific steps that government organizations, especially in the State Department, can take to foster innovation?
I think one thing that's really important is to be connected to the private sector. Not necessarily because you're asking them to do your work, but because you want to know what's out there. And it's so easy to be in a bubble. And I even feel that having only been at the State Department for less than a year, I feel that the world is rushing by and I'm in a different world. But I think it's very important to maintain those connections because it lets you be sharp about what are the things that you need to be worrying about, not just to react to, but if you're going to plan for the future, what kind of things do you need to do as a government official to make sure there's a clear path for innovation to occur in the private sector. And when you learn what folks are doing there, that gives you ideas about how to take that in to your own lexicon and use it as well. So I think that kind of connection is very, very important.
Yeah, and I guess I would wholeheartedly agree. There's, from my time when I served in Sweden, I used to love to remind Swedish audience, I'd show this picture of this woman's face on a big screen. I'd say, does anyone know who this is? And they'd inevitably shake their head. And I was like, her name is Laila Olgren. She's one of the best engineers you've ever produced as a country. And people would sort of look confused. And I said, and you've used her invention probably 10 times today at a minimum. And that would sort of get them thinking, what is it? And she was back in the 70s working on mobile telephones. And they had come a long way, the Swedes, in figuring this thing out. And Laila was an engineer. She was the only woman engineer on the project and one of the youngest. And they had, remember those old car phones? I mean, they were like this big. And they were going up and down the highway testing it. And they'd figured almost everything out. They had all the cell towers and they had the big clunky phone. But what would happen is you'd establish contact with the first tower and you establish the dial tone. And then by the time you dialed your 7 digits, you'd move far enough away from the first one, you'd lose a connection before the second tower could get your connection. So this is puzzling all these guys, right? And they can't figure it out. And then Laila raises her hand in the back of the room. And she says, well, what if you dial the number and then hit send? And everyone sort of looks at her like she's crazy. Like, what do you mean, no dial tone? She's like, yeah, no dial tone. There's a little chip in this, the old version of this. And so sure enough, that's what's normal. I mean, my kids don't know what a dial tone is, right? There's no dial tone anymore. and she patented it. It's called green button dialing. It is on all 5 billion plus cell phones around the world. And it was her realization that the wisdom in this new cell, the smartness is at the edge of the network in these little devices, not at the center like the old telephone companies were. So, long-winded answer to your question about not so much public or private, but listen to people who have different ideas at the edges of the room. Often, we in the State Department have meetings where we've got a bunch of people around one table, and then this whole secondary meeting of people who line around behind them. Listen to the people in the backbenchers, as it were.
Can I add to that?
Sure.
I think it's really important that we also listen to different groups of people, and I think the mobile revolution allows us to do that. And so one of the things I think is absolutely critical for innovation at the State Department is the realization that our counterparts aren't just our counterparts in governments, but they are folks in the NGO community, in the business community, in academia and science, and that we need to think about diplomacy in that kind of layered way. And we need to think about every issue that we're working on in that layered way so that we do get the best, the green dialing or the best thinking that's out there. And then our job is not to do exactly what any one group says, but to synthesize that and say, okay, where do we go then taking all this in? And secondly, I think it is to recognize that those networks are also diplomatic networks for us, and that it isn't just about what we say in a room, in a couch, with somebody sitting there, or in a conference table with a few people sitting around. It's how do we empower those networks of people to also be talking about the issues that we think are important in the issues of the day. And that's the beauty that we have and the ability we have now with all of the panoply of mobile technology that exists.
Let's talk a little bit more about that technology. You mentioned your iPad, and Mr. Ambassador, you held up a state-of-the-art piece of technology there. How are you encouraging your own employees to use mobile devices in their work?
Well, for me, my entire team has iPads, but more importantly, we're looking at how do we use Twitter, how do we use Snapchat, how do we use Instagram, how do we use all those things to communicate, not just communicate what we're doing, but take in from others as well. And when we did the Our Ocean conference, the Secretary's Our Ocean conference, one of the things that we built into that conference was an entire social media component in real time, beforehand, afterwards. And one of the things that we've heard comments on since then is how effective that was at actually moving policy forward and getting concrete results. So, we're encouraging everybody to think about what are those layers you can reach by using mobile technology, not just what you do, what device you hold in your hand, but how do you use it to reach out to all of these groups?
Ambassador Barzun, are you using these social networking and all those kind of things more and more?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we have 21 social media platforms here at Mission UK, so we're trying to use them all. But again, I would agree with what Kathy said. And then, I mean, I generally don't focus on the actual technology, as I said before. I just think it's an attitude, right? So even the word outreach is probably the wrong word and kind of creepy. I mean, imagine yourself being on the other side of someone outreaching. It's creepy. It's engagement, which is an overused buzzword, but it's real. And so I'm inspired by what a lot of the consulates that the U.S. runs around the world, generally smaller teams, by necessity have to reach out and connect with the alumni networks, connect with the business community, because with a tiny group of people, you couldn't possibly do it on your own. So you need help. And if you don't think you need help, then any amount of asking for help or engagement will feel phony.
Have you faced any resistance within the department to any of these kind of approaches?
No. In fact, there's a whole team of people who are incredibly expert at this, and they have been more than happy to help us engage. And every embassy we've gone to, folks are thinking creatively about, what kind of engagement should we do. And I think that's great. And I'm learning a lot from the excellent people who are at State who are working on all of this.
And maybe just a closing thought, since, and I'm sorry to have to leave, but I need to leave, and I hate to leave. One thing I am most proud of our team doing in the last year that I've been here was a wonderful collaboration between RSO and Consular and a whole number of teams here to deal with the issue where if you came into the embassy for non-immigrant visa or American citizen services and you were silly enough to not read the small print on our website and be told you shouldn't bring a smartphone, you were asked to walk 3 blocks away to a bodega and pay a woman £5 to keep your cell phone for you while you had your meeting with us, which is sort of strange on a number of levels. And so I asked the team, I said, again, I wanted to ask, not to ask. So I said, I don't know, there's probably a good reason we got to this place, but do you think there might be a less bad way of handling that? And this wonderful team said, maybe, let us look into it. So they did, and it took a bunch of time. I think it took 4 months of really reaching out, talking to Washington, talking to all the stakeholders here in the building. And then they finally got a report, and they said, sir, here it is. Would you sign this? And I said, great. How less bad is it? Are we just going to charge them £1 and keep it ourselves? Or I was open to anything other than the status quo. And sure enough, they came. They said, no, we're going to let everyone bring in their cell phones into our waiting rooms so they can engage with our 21 social media platforms. And that sounds like a small thing, but that's over 1,000 people a day feeling empowered, feeling engaged, and just as safe, because now we get to screen these devices. So it's a small thing, but I think those small acts, if accumulated and repeated again and again, can make a big impact and can send a message to more broad engagement. And with that, I just wanted Tom to thank you, Nehru to thank you, and Undersecretary Novelli, a joy to virtually be with you. And thank you all. Cheers.
Thank you, Mr.
Bye.
Ambassador. Well, I hope Undersecretary Novelli will stick around for a few more minutes
Sure.
and just do a couple more questions. How do you see the public's expectations of how the State Department will serve them, particularly in the area of mobile? How do you see that changing?
Well, I think the general public sees the State Department as these amazing people who are doing these exotic things and maybe not so much relevant to their life. And I think that's the challenge that we all have, which is to engage, to use Matthew's word, to engage the public, to make them understand how everything that we do is relevant to their life. And that is really a communication challenge. And I think the other piece of this is it's very important at embassies that citizen services be user-friendly. And I think that whole perspective of how are we friendly to users is also something that comes from the tech sector. And when Matthew was talking about an attitude and wanting to think about just that whole solution for cell phones, I think we all need to think about that in everything we do. How do we make, we're here to serve the public. The public isn't here to serve us. So how do we make what we do friendly to them? Obviously, there's certain things that are necessary that for security and things like that. But to me, that should be the first question we ask.
I was struck by something I read about what Deputy Secretary Higginbottom said earlier this year at a Tech In-State event. And I wanted to read this quote. She said, "The lifeblood of our business of diplomacy is information. Information about people, about governments, about cultures, about policies, about values. To set our people up for success, we need to let them access that information wherever they happen to be, whether in a coffee shop in Mumbai, the lobby of the Cambodian Foreign Ministry, or a bus in DC. How close are you to achieving that goal relative to your own workforce?"
Well, like I said, I feel very connected now. I really feel like we went from kind of the Stone Age to the cutting edge with the wonderful work that was done to allow fully functional smart technology to be carried around, and in a secure way. It's just fantastic, and it's seamless. There's no extra overlay, no Citrix, no nothing. It just works. And so I give huge kudos to the folks who have done this, because I think it is fantastic. And I understand there's, as there always are, tugs of wars between different folks in different parts of the department who are implementing things. But to me, the folks who've done the work that I get to use are by far, they are caring about the users and having us all work. And I think the next question is, how do we take all that and connect ourselves to the world? So Deputy Secretary Higginbottom was talking about sort of one side of the coin, which is us having information. But how do we have all that information flowing out to all of these layers of folks? Because we need them. We absolutely need them if we are going to influence governments and influence public policy in a global way. That isn't going to just come from us talking to our counterpart. That's going to come from having all these layers of folks also talk to their own governments and getting them the information they need so they can make judgments about what is in their own best interests is absolutely critical.
How do you balance that to be able to use mobile devices and social networks to get information out with the need for the department to have a consistent message?
Yeah, I think that's going to be the next frontier. I think as more and more people are comfortable using this, you're going to have people who, say things that we all wish they didn't say, and we're absolutely going to have to cope with that. And part of that is going to be who are the authoritative voices, and how do we stay on top of all of that without stifling creativity and discussion. But I think the risk is worth it. Even if there are some mistakes and missteps, I think the risk is worth it. And I think it's a necessity at this point now.
Yeah. What about cybersecurity concerns? You mentioned your devices work without overlays or anything. How big of a factor is that in being able to do the work you need to do?
Well, I'm relying upon these amazing technology folks inside of state who have, in fact, when they just rolled out this new totally seamless way of working, they said it's actually more secure than all these overlays. But those guys rolled up their sleeves and they said, what is going to be the most user-friendly, what's going to make everybody's life easier in terms of use, but how do we do that in a way that protects security? And they believe that they have, with the revelations just today of what happened with JP Morgan Chase, the truth is that we're always going to have to try to be one step ahead of hackers and others, because that's just reality. But I think that we can't all go back to living in caves and and having no internet, et cetera. We need to move forward, and we need to try to be smarter than they are.
How much of this, in terms of the State Department's use of technology and advances in mobility and things like that, how much of this is being driven from the bottom up, from employees themselves saying, we really want to use new and different ways of doing our work?
Well, there's certainly a demand. Everywhere I go, I have people going, how did you get that? How do we get it? So, I think there's a demand. And I also think, one of the things that really impressed me when I came in is that somebody on my staff, while they were actually an action officer in EB, developed an entire new website or web portal that would allow all the embassies to collect information about government procurements and about deals, interests, and partnerships that foreign companies might have, and to put that out in a very user-friendly way so that U.S. companies could just click on it, and they could click by either a type of thing, whatever they make, or by country, and see everything that's available and have the name of a State Department contact that they could contact who could help them kind of navigate this. And that was brilliant. Just a brilliant way of disseminating information in a format that everybody can use. And so I think there's a bottom-up push and a cry for the ability to do more and more and more. And I think that's that we have to find a way to be secure, as you said, but also to think about how do we empower more of this.
I think we're nearing the end of our allotted time, but I thought maybe we could wrap up by asking you to look into your crystal ball and go out, say, at least 5 years, maybe even a little more. And we're living in a highly mobile world, in an Internet of Things, when there's connected devices all over the place. Mm-hmm. What do you see as the next big thing, and where do you see things headed from here on out?
I don't know if there's one next big thing. I think what I see is that these webs of different folks with different interests are going to increase, and that those are going to be increasingly crossing boundaries. And so that you're going to see more alignment of different interests across countries, and that we're all going to have to deal with that. And country boundaries will still have meaning, and they'll still be important. But the question of who your constituencies are, I think, is going to become increasingly more complex. And we, as a State Department, are going to have to be able to deal with that and think that through, and be able to engage that entire network and to think in that networked way if we want to be effective.
Great. That seems like a great place to wrap up. Please join me in thanking Undersecretary Novelli for taking the time to share your insights this morning.
Thank you. That was wonderful. What a great perspective from the Department of State. Undersecretary Novelli, I too love my iPad. Can't live without it. And Ambassador Barzun, I hope you gave us more than 10 points for that one.